Hey, welcome back everyone. We've got an interesting episode for you this week. We just got a brand new Sun Ultra 5 delivered, and I want to go through it with you. I put a ton of research into it. Hopefully we've got something interesting for you. So this I got on eBay. The seller did a really beautiful job packing it. It arrived completely intact and as advertised. I was thrilled. But why are we looking at the low end this week? Well, it's interesting. This was a really important machine. I'd like to go into a bit of the history about it first and what was going on at the market at the time and basically why Sun produced this machine. Let's get started. So first, a bit of history. When I'm trying to understand a product or a product line, it's always really helpful to understand where it came in a company's basically production history. Whether you're talking about cars or computers, it doesn't matter. There was always a huge amount of thought put into producing a new product. So what I thought I'd do is I put together a history of some of the major firsts from Sun's Workstation history. So 1989, it was the release of the first SPARCstation 1. It was a single processor machine, 64 megs of RAM. There were SPARC-based computers that came before this one, but really this was the start of the SPARCstation era. And then around 3 years later, they came out with the SPARCstation 10. You can watch my videos on that one if you want. And it was a really important machine because it was their first multi-processor machine, and it really took a huge amount of RAM, up to 512 megs of RAM, which at the time was obscene. These were pretty expensive, very high-end workstations, and they're really, really cool. But then Sun kind of stumbled a little bit. They took too long to get their next generation processor out the door. I mean, it's not criticism. I think this is widely recognized. But in 1995, they released the Ultra series machines. These were the first 64-bit widely used desktop and workstation processors ever. They released it with the Ultra 1 and Ultra 2, the monoprocessor and dual processor machines. They could take up to 2 gigs of RAM. Their processors initially were released, I think, at 143 and 170 megahertz, and it was really the start of the Ultra era. The Ultra 30 was sort of an in-between machine, but it was an important first for Sun. It was released in 1997, and it was quite similar to the Ultra 2, with the exception that it was the first PCI machine. So the PCI bus was a faster bus than the Sun's S bus, and it was very easy to produce PCI peripherals, and there were tons of PCI peripherals, whether SCSI cards, network cards, whatever, already out in the market today, and Sun obviously wanted to use those. So the Sun Ultra 30 was a bit of an in-between machine. It was never that popular, but it was important because it was the first PCI-based machine. Then in January 1998, Sun released the Ultra 5 and its sibling, the Ultra 10, with 270 and 300 megahertz processors respectively at release, taking between half a gig to a gig of RAM. And these are really important because these were very low-end machines. They were really trying to capture the low end of the market here. They had IDE hard drives and CD-ROMs. They were built with basically PC components. They had PCI as the expansion bus, but you still got a 64-bit processor, and they released a new processor for it, the UltraSPARC 2i, for, I assume, integrated. We'll go into that in a bit more detail. And this machine was around for about 4 years. End of sale was November 2002. And it was replaced by the Sunblade 100 series, I think. But this wasn't Sun's first low-end workstation. In 1990, they had the SLC and the IPC. These were based on the SPARCstation 1 Plus CPU. In 1991, they released the IPX and the ELC based on the SPARCstation 2 CPUs. In 1992, for around $5,000, you could get a SPARC Classic. It was a low-end machine at the time, but it still wasn't cheap. I mean, $5,000 in 1992 is a very expensive computer for what we're used to paying for computers today, but it was a desktop workstation. In 1994, saw the SPARCstation 5 released for around $4,000. I mean, these are the bottom-end configurations. We're talking minimum RAM, minimum hard disk, no monitor. In 1995, they came up with the cut-down SPARCstation 5 as the SPARCstation 4 for around $3,000 for the base configuration. And then in 1998, still at the $3,000 price point, it was released at $2,995 at launch in January of 1998. And then I think in May they dropped its price by about another $500 and threw in a CD-ROM drive with it. So it was really a revolutionary low-price machine when adjusted for inflation. So the question is, why would Sun be going after the low end of the workstation market? Well, look what was happening in 1998 with CPUs for price and performance. The Pentium 2 300 MHz processor was out with spec int and floating point performance of 1.7 and 8.1, and you could get one of these machines or a clone for around $2,000. A PowerPC 603E at 300 MHz, a fair bit slower on these benchmarks, but for around the same price point, $3,000, you could get a PowerMax 6500 300, great for desktop publishing. Now, in the very high end of performance available at this time, still in a single processor workstation, SGI had the O2 line, very expensive, around $11,000 to get you into one of these workstations. Not necessarily better integer performance, but certainly better floating point performance. But we're not talking orders of magnitude here. We're talking like maybe 2x, 2 point something x better than a Pentium 2 300. So this is what Sun was going after in the market with the release of the Ultra 5, the Ultra 10. For example, the UltraSpark 2i 300 MHz processor that they came out with, the spec int and floating point performance was very similar, and they really went at the lowest price that they could put one of these machines together for. Over the life of these machines, purely out of interest here, as they released newer versions of these processors, the integer and floating point performance continued to increase. But again, why would they do this? Why would they go after the low end of the market when they were selling like $40,000 enterprise 450s and other ultra high-end machines like that? Well, this really is what they were worried about. Windows NT. Now, we all sort of joke about NT retrospectively. It was, in retrospect, a pretty clunky operating system, but it was an amazing operating system for the time. It was stable. It was reliable. It was a lot of things that Windows 95 just wasn't. And it really started taking over the market. And Microsoft had promised and actually produced versions of NT for a huge number of different platforms. There was PowerPC, there was the DEC Alpha, I think there were a few other versions as well, and they were promising more. And so everyone saw the writing on the wall. You could even argue that Sun was getting pretty late to the party, releasing these machines 2 years after NT had already been released. But the prevailing thought at the time was absolutely that if Sun wanted to slow down loss of market share to the inevitable very fast Intel processors which were being produced at that time and the very stable NT operating system, that they really needed to get into the market here. So let's take a really quick look at the Ultra 5 before we dive into the machine. It's a desktop chassis. It's got a single processor, initial release at 270 megahertz. At end of sale, it was up to 400 megahertz. It had varying levels of cache depending on the processor that you got it with. It had 3 33 megahertz PCI slots. It could take up to 4 168-pin DIMMs for up to 512 megs of RAM. It had an IDE hard drive. You could put 2 physically inside the chassis, and it came with an IDE CD-ROM drive as well. It had onboard ATI 3D graphics, and onboard 100 base T, and Crystal 4231 audio. So let's take a look at the machine now. Quick walkthrough of the machine. Here's the front of the machine. We got a power button. We got a pretty standard looking CD-ROM, floppy drive. It's a little door above the floppy drive, and that was intended to be for a PC MCIA card reader. I don't know if really they were particularly popular. They might have been used for like smart card authentication at some sites, but I never ever saw one of those that had the readers in it. Back of the machine, pretty standard power supply, mechanical on and off switch, IEC power connector. We've got the usual complement, line in, line out, mic in, speaker out, audio ports. We've got a Sun keyboard connector. We've got 2 serial ports, a DB25 and a DB9. We've got a printer port. We've got our VGA port, standard DB15. We've got a 100 megabit onboard Ethernet connector. And then this machine very nicely came with a second Ethernet card installed. It's a Sun Ethernet card, 100 megabit, 100 base T Ethernet card. Not much really on the sides of these machines. There is a Kensington lock slot here. Yeah, that's pretty much it for a tour of the outside of the machine. But as we were going by the left-hand side of the machine, you'll see that there was a sticker there. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at that. That's called the Chassis Easy label, and we can decode it. First of all, we can decode the serial number using the serial number decoder in the Sun System Handbook. So this was built at the Fremont factory, which was presumably owned by MyTac. It was an Ultra 5 or 10, which we already know. It was built in 2001. It was built in week 16. It was built on the Thursday, because it's from 1 to 5, and its build number was 0266. So we can use this to figure out it was built on April 19th, 2001. Now this BCD Series 3 thing at the bottom of it, let's take a closer look at that. So this is the Sun System Handbook. You can find copies of this online. And here we're looking at the motherboard page for the Ultra 5 and Ultra 10. And it has this section called Chassis Easy Label Notes. So you can go into it and you can look up the service code, that BCD Series 3 thing, and it tells you what motherboard was used, anything special about the NVRAM, which speaker assembly, which power supply, that sort of thing, just to give you further details about really what the vintage of this machine was. Now, I realize this is really getting into the arcana of these machines, but the goal here is really to say, hey, you know what? You can tell a lot about these machines from their serial number and things like these service codes. If you're thinking about buying them, you can make sure you're getting the vintage that you want, and make sure that basically it's a parts matching machine. In other words, that the numbers line up. If you're buying something that has a really early processor, but it's a really late machine, it means that someone has swapped out the processor on it. All right, well, let's get inside the case. So opening the case is dead easy. It's really just 2 Phillips head screws, and that's it. The case slides out really nicely. It's not one of these cases that's really hard to get on and off. They've done a great job in designing it to make it so that it's easily serviced. Now, inside the case cover, similar to a lot of other Sun products or other high-end workstations, there's just some simple diagrams which are super useful for service personnel working on these, just to remind people, hey, if you're inserting cards into these slots, if you're inserting DIMMs, here's a basic reminder. So you can see here, huge heatsink on top of the CPU. But let's start taking out some cables. So that's our hard drive IDE cable. And they're actually all properly keyed, and they're all labeled, like motherboard end versus disk end. This machine didn't come with a disk drive. You can see the audio cable there and the ATX power supply connector with all the different cables going into it. Just disconnecting the floppy cable now. And then the floppy subassembly is really easy to get out. You just loosen these 3 screws, and there's these keyhole slots. And then with just the screws loosened a little bit, you can pull the whole assembly backwards a little bit, and then it just pops out of the way, and then you can get access to the RAM slots or some of the jumpers in case you're flashing the BIOS or something like that. But I wanted to take out the PCI riser, the sort of mid-plane support there. It's important mechanical support in case you get a monitor on top of the system. And you just take out two screws, actually 4 screws total, and then the whole thing pops out, and then we can actually see the CPU. So I wouldn't normally do this. I tend to just, leave sleeping dogs lie, and if it's not broken, don't fix it. But for sort of my own interest and entertainment value, hopefully we'll pop out the CPU. Now there's no more screws to take out. Once you remove that black plastic bar and the mid plane, it comes out quite easily, but there is a little plastic retaining clip on the back that you just need to push backwards. So you can see there's the cache RAM chips with a smaller heatsink on them, then there's the large heatsink. You can see the connectors here, they're all very similar, the exact same type of connector, different pin count as the M-Bus connectors from the SparkStation 10 and SparkStation 20. So since we've got the cover off, let's walk you through the motherboard. Up here you can see the two IDE, the primary and secondary channel, as well as the floppy disk drive connectors. Above that there's the ATX power supply connector. This chip here is the CS4231A sound chip. There's a small flash chip there. That's what stores the Open Boot PROM code, or the OBP code. I guess it's not really a PROM anymore. This is an Infineon chip. It's the dual serial ports. And down there with the orange sticker on it is the infamous Sun NVRAM chip. It's a chip with it has the real-time clock chip in it, but it also has a battery, and these batteries die, and then your system loses its configuration information. So I'll do a video on how to fix those and solder on a new battery. Just in behind that, there's a Super I/O chip, so that's going to be for the parallel ports. It might be for the keyboard port as well. Below that is the ATI Rage Pro Turbo. We'll talk about some of the variants that were on the motherboard. And to the left of that, there's two black chips that I didn't label. Those are 2 megabyte SG RAM chips for a total of 4 megabytes of SG RAM. Just to the right of that is a CMD646U IDE controller. Now this has a bug in it, and you can't quite max out the speed that you should be able to with this, but you can still get, I think, 16.7 megabytes per second through on it. And below that is the Sun ASIC for the 100 base T connection, and then to the left of that is the National Semiconductor PHY chip for it. Up in the top right-hand corner, there's the 4 DIMM slots. Just below that is a UPA slot. UPA, this in the Ultra 10 allows you to plug in some of Sun's really high-end graphics cards, but there's just no mechanical way to plug a card into this in the Ultra 5. It's too crowded, there's no riser, etc., etc. This is the PCI riser that you saw me take out a couple minutes ago. These are the RAM transceivers. So in the UltraSpark 2i processor, they built the memory controller into the actual CPU itself. So it talks to the DIMMs through these transceivers. This is a chip called the RIC, and it's the Reset, Interrupt, and Clock controller chip. This is the PCI bridge. And what they also did with the UltraSpark 2i was they integrated a 66 megahertz 32-bit PCI bus into the CPU, and that goes into this PCI bridge that splits it into two PCI bridges. And we'll show you a system diagram of this in a second. Anyway, that's pretty much it for the major components on the motherboard. One other thing you can see is that there's a number of electrolytic caps on the bottom of the motherboard, and that is sort of also a first for Sun, good and bad. I'm sure it's a lower component cost, but all of the previous Sun SparkStations that I've got and I've seen, none of them had electrolytic caps on them. So maybe someday these will be a problem, but at least for now they seem okay and they're not leaking. So I've mentioned the Ultra 10 a couple times. The Ultra 5 and the Ultra 10 have the exact same motherboard, and as far as I know, I think they run essentially the same BIOS, because when you boot it up it says Ultra 5/10. There, of course, would be really no way for the motherboard to know what chassis it had been installed in. But let's go through some of the comparison here. So the Ultra 5 was a desktop chassis. The Ultra 10 was a mini tower. The Ultra 5 has one 5.25-inch expansion bay. It's filled with the CD-ROM. The mini tower in the Ultra 10 has an extra 5.25-inch expansion bay. The Ultra 5 was initially released with a 270 megahertz CPU with 256 kilobytes of level 2 cache. The Ultra 10 was initially released with a 300 megahertz CPU with 512 kilobytes of cache, but by the end of the line, they'd gotten quite close in terms of the CPU capabilities, with the Ultra 5 having a 400 megahertz CPU and the Ultra 10 having a 440 megahertz CPU, and fairly minor performance differences between the two. You could get a 440 megahertz upgrade for any of these, including the Ultra 5, if you wanted to. The Ultra 5 also initially, they said it was limited to 512 megs of RAM, but again, it's the same motherboard, and by the end of its life, you could put in 1 gigabyte of RAM. And then finally, the other major difference is that the Ultra 5, because of its sort of form factor, essentially, it only has 3 PCI slots. The Ultra 10 has a different PCI riser card in it, and you can fit in 4 PCI cards for expansion, and that brown slot we saw on the motherboard, the UPA slot, you can actually use that. So you can put in one of Sun's higher-end graphics cards, like the Creator 3D card or the Elite 3D M3 card. Can also go in here for much higher-end 3D kind of modeling, that sort of thing. Now, just a bit on the evolution of the Sun. There was a model of the Ultra 5 sold as the Enterprise Ultra 5S, and it was sold as a small office server, really for sort of web server file and print sharing tasks. I don't know why anyone, if they ran a small office, would want to run a Unix box to do that, given the high degree of skill set you'd need to actually use Solaris for that, but they would have been fine machines, and you could certainly put 2 IDE hard drives in them, run them in a mirror configuration, and at least get basic redundancy available. The earliest version of the Ultra 5 had the CMD 640 chip in it. As the IDE controller, has even less performance than the 646U, which is in the final version. It also had an ATI Rage Pro 2, which Sun called its PGX graphics, which only had 2 megabytes of RAM. The later Ultra 5s had the CMD 646U and a Rage Pro Turbo with 4 megabytes of RAM, which Sun called its PGX 24 for 24-bit graphics. As I mentioned earlier, you could buy a separate X option, 440 megahertz upgrade. You could put in up to 1 gig of RAM as well. So I also wanted to compare the Ultra 5 versus the Ultra 30. So Ultra 30 was the prior PCI machine. Now, it was not considered a low-end workstation by Sun, but you can see why the Ultra 30 was so short-lived when we sort of do a comparison. Again, desktop versus mid-tower. The Ultra 5 started at around $3,000, and the Ultra 30 was more than 5 times as expensive, starting around $16,500. The Ultra 5 came out at 270 megahertz and went up to 400 megahertz, and the Ultra 30 was only ever compatible with 250 megahertz and 300 megahertz CPUs. I think there was a hack you could do to use faster CPUs, but it certainly wouldn't have been supported by Sun. Now, the Ultra 5 was limited to 512 megs of RAM. You could expand it up later to 1 gig of RAM, but the Ultra 30, it had 16 DIMM slots in it, and with 128 megabyte DIMMs, you could put in up to 2 gigs of RAM. Again, the Ultra 30 has more PCI slots, very similar to an Ultra 10, but the Ultra 30 also had 2 UPA slots, so you could run dual-headed, very high-end graphics cards in it. The Ultra 5 has IDE, so it's got a bit of a slower disk subsystem, certainly compared to the Ultra 30, which supports Ultra SCSI 3. And then the Ultra 5 has onboard graphics, 100 base T and audio, and the Ultra 30 just has 100 base T and audio. There's no onboard graphics in an Ultra 30. So you can see why the Ultra 30 was so short-lived. It'd be hard to really look at it and say, oh yeah, this represents 6 times the value, unless you absolutely needed ultra high-end graphics cards for it. You could certainly run the Ultra 5 in a dual-headed configuration, but it would be with the onboard PCI graphics and with a separate PCI graphics card in it. But again, you'd really have to justify massive employee productivity uptick to be able to justify needing the Ultra 30. You can always come up with, as a server, sure, absolutely. But Sun sold separate servers for, with redundant power supplies, if that was sort of what you were getting into. So let's take a look at the Ultra 30 architecture, because the Ultra 30 architecture was similar to some of the earlier, like the Ultra 2 and then to the later Ultra 60 architecture. And it's quite different from the Ultra 5 and Ultra 10. So the Ultra 30 architecture uses an UltraSpark 2 CPU, which plugs into the UP8 bus and a large crossbar ASIC for communication with memory, with its UPA slots. It has a system controller ASIC on it, which really does quite a bit of the control and communication between all of these elements. It has a PCI bus ASIC to convert from the UPA bus to PCI. It's got a 66 megahertz 64-bit PCI slot, and then it's got another bus, which is a 33 megahertz 64-bit bus as well. So you can see really the key point here is that the CPU is just a standalone CPU, and everything is done by a whole host of other ASICs on the motherboard itself. Now the Ultra 5 architecture, you can see why it's so much cheaper for Sun. By integrating the memory controller, by integrating the PCI bus into the CPU itself, what they're able to do basically was just connect the CPU via the transceivers directly to the SIM slots, directly to the APB ASIC, which was the PCI bridge ASIC. It basically converts this 66 megahertz 32-bit PCI bus into 2 separate 32-bit 33 megahertz PCI buses, one which serves the PCI slots, and then the other which serves all the onboard functionality, like the IDE chip, the CMD chip, the network card, and the onboard graphics card as well. And then, as mentioned earlier, there is the UPA64S slot just for graphics cards only, but that's in the Ultra 10 only. Alright, but enough gabbing, let's boot it up. So I'm just monitoring the serial port here, and you can see so far so good. Its NVRAM is dead, no surprise, it's 20 years old, but it finds the CPU, it finds the memory, it finds all the devices on the PCI bus, and we can also take a look at the screen and watch it boot as well. Here we are. It's tested through the 256 megs of RAM. Okay, comes up. Because its NVRAM is dead, it tries to boot from the network. So I'm just going to stop that and get it to probe the IDE devices. And you can see there it comes up with the CD-ROM drive. It was sold without a hard drive. So we're basically good to go. So that's all I've got right now. We're definitely going to do some upgrades to this. One of them is actually really, really cool. I wish I could have released it in December, just to give you a hint. But I think I still got to wait for some stuff to come in. But I think we'll have some fun with this one. I'm really looking forward to it. Anyway, I hope everyone has a great week. Stay safe, and we'll catch up soon.